Hi everybody, it's Dr. K from Holistic Minds. I want to bet you that you can't figure out one of the most significant causes of anxiety, ADHD, poor focus and concentration, and even social phobias. In my observation, at least 5% of kids that have this cluster of symptoms have this one primary issue that is missed 99.9% of the time. I want you to look at this list and think which of these factors is that one cause. And your kid may be the 1 in 20, the 5% that actually has this issue. And if you miss this, nothing will get better until you actually address it. What do you think? Is it nutritional? Is it genetics? Is it a gut issue? Is it toxins? Because these are the things that we talk about, right? These are the things that websites are talking about. There are videos on it. You can check on YouTube. People have written books. There's on and on and on and on. And it's none of those things. It's actually a tongue tie. It is an attachment from the base of the tongue to the base of the mouth that keeps the tongue from moving up. And kids that have this issue cannot do this. When they try to open their mouth all the way, their tongues only go halfway and get stuck. These kids also have issues eating. So they're the slow eaters. It takes them 30 minutes, 45 minutes to finish a meal. They were often the kids that early on had trouble with solids. So they would spit the solids out. Sometimes they would choke on the solids. Sometimes they were super slow to eat. Or they had texture issues where they would stick out purees or other foods. And now, in older age, a lot of these kids cannot handle certain textures. So for instance, a best test if you guys eat meat is to give a child that has this issue a big chunk of steak. They'll chew it if they're willing to chew it. A lot of the kids won't even be willing to chew it. They just flat out reject it. If they do chew it, what will often happen is they'll actually spit it out because they can't handle the chewing. Why? Because their tongue isn't working. This big old muscle that needs to move food around our mouth and ultimately help us chew and digest food doesn't work. So it's almost like you have a tongue that's paralyzed. And if you can imagine what that's like to eat, it makes it so much more difficult. And why I'm bringing this up with you is just recently I had my third patient in the last 6 months show up with exactly the same issue. And this little one, we'll say his name is Thomas, we'll say he's 11 years old, showed up with ADHD, severe ADHD. He couldn't focus, he couldn't concentrate, he had to sit in front of the classroom, constantly distracted, constantly all over the place. He also had pretty severe anxiety. He couldn't handle being in big social environments. I mean, he was really, really struggling. He had been put on medications that kind of helped, but the family wasn't comfortable putting their 11-year-old on medications, so they wanted something different. And, you know, the mom's first question to me is like, okay, well, we want to fix his ADHD. So should we change his diet? Should we treat his gut? Should we do these? And I kept looking. And what was so interesting about Thomas is he was a really, really small guy. Second percentile height and weight, which is also semi-common in these scenarios. It's not always exclusive, but it's fairly common. And the part that was really interesting about Thomas, and this was the one giveaway clue, his face was flat. So you look at most people, we have this developed mandible where the mandible kind of comes out. For kids who have tongue ties, their faces are really, really flat. And that's because their tongue isn't pushing against the upper teeth to push them out. So they end up developing a flat face because the tongue is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. The part that's really interesting is we also have a pressure point in the upper palate. And when the tongue pushes on that pressure point, it activates the circuit, essentially, that helps the nervous system calm down. It activates part of the parasympathetic rest and relaxation state. Without that pressure point being touched on by the tongue, what happens is essentially you have a short circuit and you have someone that's in a constant state of fight and flight. And with some of these children, not all, I'd say 60% of them, if you go back, they're the kids that were hard to console, hard to put down, hard to get them to sleep, hard to actually console them. So you had to bounce them and rock them all the time. And this started early on. As the older kids, like this little guy, he had a hard time falling asleep. He wouldn't fall asleep until midnight. And that's after like a whole bunch of things that they were trying. And sometimes parents go for melatonin or magnesium or all this stuff. It's the tongue tie. You need to fix the tongue tie because the system can't relax without it. Now, why do you think this child's tongue tie was causing the attention problems, focus problems, distractibility? What innervates the eye? Nerves, right? What innervates the ears? Nerves. They're called the cranial nerves. It turns out when you got this big old muscle, aka the tongue, right? The tongue is a huge muscle that sits in our mouth and is constantly moving around to do stuff, to talk, to chew, so forth. If it's tied down, you have this rubber band where the muscle is constantly yanking. And what is it yanking on? The base of the neck, the base of the head. What happens after years of constant tugging? You end up creating restrictions in the back of the neck. What does that affect? It ends up affecting the cranial nerves. It affects the vagus nerve, which is our master rest and relaxation nerve. So these kids have another reason why they can't calm down. Sometimes it affects the muscles that move the eyes. So for some of these kids, and in the case of this little guy, he had trouble reading. He couldn't read very well. He was a slow reader. Sometimes people had to read questions to him. Some kids have auditory sensory issues where they can't control the volume of the sound. So when they go into crowded spaces, things are too loud for them. We take it for granted that when we can go into a loud, crowded space, our mind, our ears can actually dampen the sound so we don't get overwhelmed. Some kids can't do that. Some adults can't do that. These are all reflections of cranial nerve imbalances that could be coming from a tongue. And it would be so easy to overlook this and just medicate these kids or just focus on let's treat the gut, let's treat the diet, let's treat the toxins. You know, those things need to be done. I'm not saying they don't need to be done, but you can't do them until you fix the mouth. A kid that can't eat, you can't expect them to chew and digest food properly, and therefore their guts are going to be a mess. You can't fix their gut until you fix their mouth. And this is what is so absolutely critical for you to understand in terms of the healing process, in terms of the healing picture of your child. Because if your child has a tongue tie, you can do everything under the sun, everything under the sun. You can spend thousands of dollars on diets and supplements and therapies and do all of these things. Nothing will work until you address this. And that's why I've created Holistic Minds, because I want to give you these kinds of details for you to understand so you can get exactly the right answers in terms of why your kid is being affected and what steps you need to do to take to heal them. So join us in Holistic Minds. Let's share this information with people so every parent can have access to this information and every parent could be aware of these things. Because these are things that we can treat, these are things that we can take care of, and it can make a world of difference in the kids, perhaps your kid's life, now and forever. Because kids don't have to be handicapped like this anymore. Kids don't need to have these kinds of restrictions, and we just call it normal because we don't know what else to call it. So let's create a new conversation. Let's create a new understanding, and let's step into the future so we can work together to make so many more kids, including your kid, as healthy as they can be. Thanks so much for listening. This is Dr. K from Holistic Minds.